Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast, part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcast to see all of their shows there. My name is Caleb Keith. I'm joined by my father, Scott Keith, by Adam Francisco, and by Bruce Hillman to do, I think we even talked about it in the episode, a part 2 on a dangerous exposition on the political situation in the West, focusing primarily last episode on defining, and Adam gave us actually a history that I did not know, which was helpful, and I'm sure many users found helpful, of terms like woke. And I think what ended up being suggested was that maybe not all the adherents or people who say it, but certainly there is a would you call it a new liberalism, Adam, that has a worldview that is antithetical and probably and definitely on the attack against Christianity. And we left that with us, like a question that we would pick up this time, which is, should Christians or should do anything about it? I guess you could phrase it in a clickbaity way. You could say, should Christians fight the culture war? Bum, bum, bum. But
yeah. Could you splice in actual music there?
I could get fancy.
That'd be awesome. Last time we would you call it a dangerous exposition? It was. I mean, we were quite traversing quite a wide swath of land concerning the woke stuff, and we want to on this podcast because we're not. This is not political, though one could argue all of life is political. But
boy,
we are by nature political creatures, right? If we want to use Aristotle's.
I mean, that's Aristotle, not Jesus, but go for it.
Yeah, but we want, there is a worldview or religious, or I think we use the term even metaphysical component behind this wokeism, and it does stem from a worldview that started to gain momentum in the late 1960s, certainly in the 70s, that at least intellectual historians, people who trace the pedigree of ideas, will call the New Left, which is very different than just your run-of-the-mill traditional American liberal. There's a Marxist component to it. There's a postmodern component to it. There's and all that stuff works itself out into like these critical theories and so on. It's a complicated soup, to be sure.
As Bruce pointed out, there's at least like a religious pattern to
sure. It parallels religion.
Well.
Sure. I was going to say that I just I don't get a lot of news in the news feed because I don't have a news feed. But I just heard and I just looked at it on Yahoo News. Is that okay? Is that a good source?
No, but go for it.
That Greta Thunberg is receiving an honorary doctorate from the University of Helsinki in theology.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So she's
Can we talk about this for a second?
Theology.
She's sort of the famous environmental activist. But if you've ever heard her talk, she does sort of not just environmental activism, but she does social justice stuff. She does woke stuff. She does a lot of ESG, environmental, social, government. Yeah, that's what it is.
So if you tell people that you ruined their childhood, you get an honorary degree in theology now.
Well, and so I think it's it's anecdotal certainly, but it's just illustrative of the fact that this is a religion for people. It's not just all of this kind of mashup of social justice, environmental activism, kind of, which I think whether or not they have the same tenets, they certainly use the same backing and sort of logistical framework to get the things moving. They're religious in nature. I mean, they're at the very least supporting religion or replacing a religious belief that would give some sort of meaning to life that's not just, the meme of who knew adult life was waking up, deciding what you had for dinner every day, and then doing it again the next day. If that's sort of what quote unquote adulting is, and you have nothing else that provides meaning. Maybe not even children. You'll be pretty easily sucked into something else that can give you a higher purpose, and I think this stuff certainly does that for people.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thesis of John McWhorter's book Woke Racism, which I mentioned last week, and which I find compelling because he argues it is religious for a series of reasons, which I won't get into. You could read his book if you want the argument, but one of the reasons is that these people act like they are an elect. In the sense, that's the term he uses. That's his term. That they are chosen or fated or have come to the conclusion in some way that their way is the salvation of the world for climate change, for morals, for everything else, and therefore it's not a rational discourse over the good anymore. They have been elected, chosen in their own minds, to promote this, and anything against it is heresy and is a threat. And that's different than just a pure ideology where you could be a Marxist and you can say, well, this is what I think is the best form of government in the world. But I understand the arguments for democracy. It's just not what I want. That's not what I sense a lot of times is going on in the quote woke movement.
See, I'm going to take.
And by the way, the right shares the right uses these tactics and is quickly being corrupted by the same, if not in some parts already has been corrupted by the same kind of narrowism. Just with
completely
ideology.
I completely agree with that.
I'm going to take a little issue with McWhorter's thesis. I think I listened to him and Glenn Lowry on, I think it's called The Glenn Show, quite a bit. Big fan of his. He is, however, critical of religion, and I think that book is, whether it's willing, whether he does it purposely or not, there's a suggestion that religion is bad is sort of like the assumption, and because wokeism is like a religion, therefore wokeism is bad. I would do the converse, mostly probably because I define ideology much more narrowly than just a worldview. I think it's more of an ideology, and so therefore it's much more dangerous than a religion, because it does have a political telos that it's not just willing to fight for, but has to fight for meaning.
Doesn't ideology have a less defined series of dogmas than a religion, and that's sort of why you can debate a religion, because you can sort of look up what the dogmas to the religion are, right? And so you can have a debate. My dogmas are this, yours are that,
and they're founded in X.
They're founded in X, so they have a material and a formal principle, right? They have sort of what the thing is and what is the thing founded on, and we can argue over both of those. Are these founding ideas, principles, documents, whatever, valid? Are they good sources of authority? And then do the ideas that spring forth from them actually hold merit, not just from the sources themselves, but in the world at large? And an ideology doesn't have that, and so that's why it's sort of mushy.
Yes. So ideology is variously defined. Some people see it just as like a synonym for worldview. I take my definition from more like the political science tradition, where an ideology, to be sure, it's not like there's 20 doctrines with sub-doctrines clearly defined, but there is a totalizing vision for things. But it's flexible too. But what's peculiar about ideology in contrast to say worldview is it has a definite political end, and there's I don't want to say clearly defined struggle, but there is a struggle that somebody who's indoctrinated into that ideology will or must participate in, and it's a sort of zero-sum game. We've got to win this, or it's all over. So it's very religious. It looks very religious. My issue is with McWhorter being anti-religion in general. I think that's why he's right that it certainly looks like religion. It parallels it, but it doesn't have the otherworldly aspects that religion does. Now, one could certainly argue that, well, yes, it does, because it's trying to immanentize the eschaton or something like that. But this is just a.
But in your definition of ideology, I'm just trying to understand. Wouldn't that view of ideology be implicit in all religions anyway? In other words, that
no,
to be a religion, you'd have to have that
It's
ideology.
in a lot of religions. So ideologies are in principle not falsifiable, like Marxism. And I would argue that Christianity, there's a few others maybe that are in principle falsifiable, that are their truthfulness depends upon certain basic facts.
Well, it also isn't so. Is you making a distinction between a religion and a theology? Because theology proper has to have sort of a God attached to it. I mean, that's the whole idea behind theology, is that you're sort of describing God. You're talking about God. It's words about God or words from God.
And your ideology might be
ideology
worth fighting for if it's from God.
Yeah,
right?
your ideology might be worth fighting for if you can show that this is sort of from God, but it's usually detached from the idea of God, and maybe even rejecting the idea of God and founding some importance in something other than a theology, and thus it's an ideology. The importance is in the idea, not the source of the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would you do about like Zen Buddhists or Unitarian Universalists? Like, how would they fit within?
Well, they still are talking about God, though, but in both sense.
Zen Buddhists aren't.
Well, okay, what's the Buddha? He's not sort of the ultimate sense of being, but it is sort of the ultimate authority. It's named after him, for Pete's sake.
Yeah, Buddhism. But in Zen, that's not
Zen,
the view.
Well, Zen is atheism, so I guess it's essentially meditative atheism. So
maybe one could argue that that's not a theology then.
Yeah.
Well, this is my point. My point is, and it's making Adam's greater point in one sense, which is like when you try to define words like woke, and when you try to make distinctions between ideology and religion, you need to make those distinctions in order to have an intelligent conversation, but they're always sort of fragile. And the more you zoom in to try to understand, the more sort of definitions you have to create, but then the more unstable and inaccurate the sort of cosmic sense of things becomes, which is partially, I think, why ideologies can be so seductive, is because people can camouflage them in their religions and not even know they're there. So people do this with politics all the time. They use political language in their religion, or they use religious language in politics, and they don't really see that like that shouldn't necessarily always be the case. Those things aren't a one-to-one correlation, but in their minds, they become a one-to-one correlation because the lines between these definitions and concepts is kind of it's like a spectrum, I guess. It's more of a gradient, like, you know, when you see like a gray scale and it's like black in the middle, and then as you go left and right, like it gets like different shades of gray, and so, like that's how I feel it. It's more like that. It's like where do you want to stand?
Yeah, I would just I take my definition of ideology from Kenneth Minogue. Alien Powers is the sort of classic book, and he identifies these key features of what ideology really is. It's not just because, again, it's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit and is used as a synonym for worldview. And I just think there's much more to it than that, in that it is very dogmatic, like religion can be. It just has a temporal end in mind.
Always.
And it is. Think of I don't know how many Marxists you all have met, but I remember like over in Oxford, you meet these Marxists, and no kidding, the stereotype of Marxist just rings true. When you critique Marxism, they say, well, that's because it hasn't been implemented correctly yet. It's like, well, how many millions of people need to die? Yeah. So even though Marxism has been falsified the whole 20th century by and large, to be a disaster or shown to be a disaster, it still is around because it's an ideology. Or it's like Islamism is an ideology. It's not actually intended to be practical. It's not actually intended to work. It's just intended to be an idea that you hold to as sort of the Platonic good of worldly ideas. You probably will never sort of.
Can't you critique it? Isn't that a good example of being able to critique it? Because like the Marxists I know would say, well, the reason why Marxism hasn't worked is it hasn't happened yet because Marx said that it has to evolve. People haven't evolved to that point yet. Like these countries have tried to create revolution. Like that's a critique of the system.
It is, but that's also just that's a deflection. That's again to go with Adam's point. That's unprovable. the status of human evolution is something you can't.
But it's provable in that you can go to Marx and you can quote Marx and Engels, and you can say that Marx warned against trying to create.
That's internally consistent. That's not different. That's different than externally verifiable. And it's internally consistent does not equal provable in the sense of you can get some external verification for the accuracy of the claim. Yeah. Those aren't the same thing, and people. The funny thing is, people do that. I mean, personally, I think I'm going to get ripped for this. This is one of my biggest sort of reasons I'm not a Calvinist.
Oh boy,
it just is. I mean, I'm sorry, it is. It's an incredibly internally consistent system that I don't think matches with the external verification of what the scriptures say.
Yes,
but it's internally consistent. In other words, I'm very drawn to it for its internal consistency. I really like the idea of God both electing to salvation and damnation being, a super consistent system. I'm drawn to that. I just don't think that's what the scriptures say. I'm really drawn to the idea of, listen, dude, this is bread and wine up there. I could put it under a microscope and it's still bread and wine. Therefore, it's got to be something other that's happening there than you're actually.
It's got to be spiritual.
Yeah, it's got to be something other than me actually receiving, consuming whatever the body and blood of Christ here. That's super consistent. The system works great. It's a nice, tidy little bunny ears on my bow on my shoe, and I love that. I'm a little OCD. But at the same time, I don't think that's what the scriptures say.
You can verify, though, that Mao, and to the extent that you can verify religion, you can also verify that, say, Mao and Stalin weren't true Marxists, depending on how you want to define Marxism, just like depending on how you want to define Catholicism or Islam or ideology or religion. Like, you can go through and you can say, here's a checklist of what it means to be a true Marxist, and nope, Stalin didn't meet it. Like, you could objectively verify it if you were a Marxist.
You'd have to, but this gets back to this actually gets back to my original point on formal and material principles. You'd have to have an agreed upon formal principle in order to do that. And I think that's one of the personally, I think that's one of the things that ideologies lack that actual theologies don't.
Because for everybody who will appeal to Marx, another person will say, well, Marx was sort of imperfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Or appeal to this work of Marx or that work of Marx or this. It's like trying to nail Mormons down, for Pete's sake. Which book are you appealing to? And at the same time, it's, I could be wrong. I'm willing to be wrong on this, but it seems to me as you all thrash this out, and I don't really care, that at the end of the day, what you're arguing over is, whether or not there is some final piece or source that a person that is claimed to be from God, that a person can appeal to as a source of authority. That's what makes it a theology. I mean, properly speaking, just definitionally, that's what a theology is. You are parsing out the words usually from God and about God. And an ideology is discussions over an idea that should have primacy as we sort of live our lives.
Yeah.
So as almighty,
I said primacy, I was British.
As almighty host and editor, I'm going to move us on.
I said it like Jean-Luc Picard.
Oh, good. Good for you.
Make it so.
Okay, so here's I think what we can move to, whether or not we have
He's actually supposed to be French, but has a British accent. And in the new series, he's got a son who's also would then be French. Who's got a British accent. It's a little weird.
New series is fantastic.
Many French are living in England and vice versa.
It's mostly
they got that little
around,
tunnel thing.
It's a little weird.
And,
all right, sorry, go ahead.
Nerds.
Okay, so we have I think whether or not we agree on the precise definitions of ideology or religion, the question that we can move on to, and the question of the episode, is how then, or ought a Christian fight this culture war? And if it really is a religion or an ideology, either direction, are examples of the past of how the church has dealt or still deals with other religions in the world. This wouldn't be, I guess, the first new religion, and it certainly wouldn't be the first religious system that attacked Christianity or Christians. So then ought we go on a crusade to go destroy the Turk? Is that is Is
I'm
that
already
an
on
example?
record.
You're speaking
I'm
my
already
love
on
language.
record. Yeah, I'm already on record having said that I don't think the Lutherans should have drowned the Anabaptists.
So you're not going to toss your hat in crusade land?
I'm on record with this one. So
maybe regretfully.
I think that the Christians trying to take back Jerusalem at the cost of many lives is a little silly. This is weird. Is God still tabernacling in the temple only, and so we had to go take that thing back? That's a little strange.
Well, I mean,
So
you
purely
just open
from
up a
religious-
Pandora's box if we're doing crusades, man.
Yeah, I don't teach a class on this, so never have.
Can I give a quick answer to your question, Caleb, just to kind of get us back a little bit?
Yeah.
I would say a Christian, can I use Latin, qua citizen? Absolutely. A Christian qua.
I thought we were going to get like a whole phrase. I was like,
Ergo, we will not.
Yeah. I was like getting my Latin on and be like, all right, yeah, let's do some phrase interpretation here. No, we get a word.
Adam's like, you impressed with qua?
I am.
Sorry. But,
that's good.
Christians living in the left-hand kingdom as citizens and participants of any sort of social, political community, if they're actually active in that community, are going to have no choice as a citizen. If they have kids going off to school and they're being groomed to be non-binary jellyfishes or whatever that's what my son identified as in one of his classes. Got in trouble for it, for mocking other stuff. But
a non-binary jello-fish?
Jellyfish, yeah, sorry. No,
jellyfish.
Sorry, my mouth wasn't working.
That's funny.
Jellyfish aren't they asexual? They are non-binary. That's how his teacher should have been impressed. That's
That's rather clever.
Well, his teacher was not impressed, so he got in a little bit of trouble.
He didn't even get like clever points.
No, because of course, implicit is a critique of all the pronoun stuff. So,
well, it's a clever.
Yeah. I was like, wow, your wrestler brain came up with that. That's pretty impressive. But anyway, so
your wrestler brain.
And how do you fight it though? Right, Caleb, is another question. Is certainly the most civil way is right at the voting booth and in your conversation with your friends and neighbors and so on. But I would say a Christian who's shall we say, I don't want to use the word obligation because I think your dad will start shaking uncontrollably with anger, but Christian who is, oh boy, what would be the term? Who has the great pleasure of confessing the faith and worshiping the one true God. It's really not.
That's called a calling.
Okay, yeah, they're. I don't think it's a calling for the Christian as a Christian to fight culture wars. I think you'd agree with me, Scott, right?
I think we're sort of grasping at what would be a very Lutheran answer here, which is that the Christian is called to be a citizen in the world, right? And that
and to fight the Turk.
That's not actually what Luther said. You know that if he was found in the lands of the Turk,
I know.
It's not.
It's just fun. We're having fun.
Okay. That you are certainly called to engage in whatever sort of behaviors or acts that are open to you as a citizen in the land in which you live. And even to sort of use those abilities to change things within the polis of the area where you live. Now, we live here in the USA, and to date, we still have quite a bit of freedom to try to influence things in various ways, including the voting booth, including by use of our free speech, including by attempting to organize people and movements. These are all permissible to us under our form of government. It's even permissible to us to try to change certain aspects of our government and forms of government, if capable, without sort of risking the sword. Now, I think the question would be: are there times when it's worth risking the sword? Not that I love these Bonhoeffer, however you want to say it, discussions, but he's usually the one that's brought up with this type of thing, right? Is it the duty, there you go, Adam, of a Christian to risk the sword to fight a political movement in the land in which you live, if that movement reaches a certain level of evil. Bonhoeffer's answer, I believe, Bruce would know better than me, probably Adam too, but Bonhoeffer's answer, I believe, was one, to acknowledge that doing so, attempting to kill Hitler, was likely a sin, but that it was a lesser sin than continuing to allow Hitler to be the murderous prick that he was.
I think that, and that, the distinction I would get to that Adam was making between a Christian as a Christian and a Christian as a citizen.
Christian.
Yeah, thank you. Is that the decision of if they are evil enough or if it's worth risking the sword isn't, and maybe people will not like this, but isn't a matter of the gospel and thus the proper work of the church, but would be something to run through your vocations, and that all Christians might not have the same, obligation to do so based on their station in life, and others might. Others who might be closer to the situation, have the power to act, maybe other obligations to your family, to your spouse, to employers or employees who depend on you, make risking your life for the sword better or worse, or whatever it may be. So the question becomes more complicated, and thus you can't just give an ideological answer from the church that says all Christians must die on X sword in the United States.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest. We're having this discussion as people who all live in a country where you have a lot of leeway as an individual citizen to try to influence things one way or another ideologically / politically in our country. I mean, it's the bigger question to me becomes, there's a movement within the church to have the church not as like just the individuals in a body of believers, but as an organization, right? As a sort of political organization, in that the church is also organized in the left-hand kingdom. In other words,
as an institution.
As an institution, they incorporate, they file 990 tax returns, all this stuff, right? Is that organization, that sort of institution, is it its job to
levy the group resources,
to fight against the tide of wokeness? That's the big discussion, I think, right now. And if you sort of, as I do, believe, I think with the Augsburg Confession, that the primary function of the church is to proclaim the gospel and administer the sacraments, that your answer to that is a little less of a resounding yes, let's pick up the sword against the woke fight as an institution, and that sometimes gets translated as, oh, you're a liberal. And it gets to be a little frustrating, because no, I'm
really not.
Really not. But it's
I can vouch for that. He's definitely no liberal.
This is a discussion to me about what is the calling, bring that back, of the church. And I just don't think that it's strictly the calling to sort of fight political battles in a culture. Because you could very much, as history has shown, decide that you're on one side of a political fight as the church, which you think is the right fight, and end up being really on not the side of justice that you thought you were on.
May I do a little
and also
devil's advocate
not
here,
doing what the church is supposed to do?
As somebody who largely who agrees with you on this, but I want to push back a little bit and push back against myself. Then also, in fact, I've written an article on this, critiquing the action of our sort of institutional church in doing this, so I've been on the record. But
I remember I was shadow cabinet for that article.
Yeah, and then so I was on the record, and maybe a time that I didn't realize was not a good time to be on the record as well. But I'll just say I accidentally published this article while the president of the LCMS was on a tour in our area to fundraise for the institution I was critiquing. So that was probably not ideal and not on purpose either, because I was trying to critique an idea and not a person. But my pushback would be, is there a limit to that insofar as the institution, like you said, is filing taxes, is subject to the
filing
laws,
tax returns.
Filing tax returns. They're doing things to maintain a nonprofit status.
Correct.
We have to file returns and documentation with the state every year in California. You're doing various things. Are there things that the institutional church ought to fight? So, like, if laws were trying to revoke, say, nonprofit status, or if the government was trying to take land away from churches or something like that, is there a limit to where, as an institution which has certain legal requirements and legal protections by our government, ought it draw a line somewhere?
This gets to be an excessively practical discussion now, because now you're sort of in the realm of lobbying, right? And you're now in the realm of is lobbying in itself a good thing or a bad thing? And lobbying is, at its ideal, just a way that a group of individuals that are trying to, that are seeking some political change, join together and, contract the use of an advocate who's got more direct access to their political representatives to vote one way or another. So say a bill comes up for the revocation of nonprofit status of churches, all right? This isn't, now think about it this way. This is going to blow your mind right here. This isn't something that an institution is going to be worried about, because institutions don't worry. They're institutions, right? This is going to be something that people within those institutions do worry about, because they're worried about the institution. Now the question is, should those people contract an advocate that has more direct access to their representatives to try to influence their vote, the representatives' vote, positively or negatively concerning said issue? That's an interest, and I think that's the question here. But what often happens is, that drives me crazy, is that institutions themselves sort of get humanized, to the sense where the institution is worried about it.
Well, then institutions don't fight either, and I agree with you. But part of this is a little bit artificial. Part of what we're debating is a little bit artificial in this sense. We have allowed, because we have to in a democracy, those who are not in the church to define the church. So when we talk about the church as institution, that's not the language the church has used. The church has historically used visible and invisible. As soon as you call the church the institution, you're allowing the IRS to define what they think the church is, because they're saying, and I mean, look, Scientology knew this well, because they wanted tax exempt status and they needed it from the IRS. To call the church an institution is to really commandeer the government's view of what we are. And so it's an artificial line in the sand. It's not a real line.
It's not artificial in the sense that every church in this country that exists wants tax-free status.
No, completely agree.
Yeah, that's why I said there's a practical discussion here, and I tried to start it out that way, that there's a practical element here to this.
But the practical question arises out of the premise of the church being an institution.
Yeah,
and I'm saying, but it's not an institution insofar as the church defines itself. It's only an institution because Uncle Sam says it's an institution.
I have a giant disagreement with you here, and we're getting way off of woke. But I agree, right? But every church in this country has incorporated, and as part of that incorporation process, written something called a constitution, by which it is governed and by which it then applies for tax-exempt status from the IRS, which is a branch of the government, and thus have institutionalized themselves. Even while saying, and I agree that this is a visible, invisible thing.
That doesn't make them that. In other words, they were told, if you want this benefit, this is what you have to do. But that doesn't mean that, so if I dye my hair red, that doesn't mean my hair is red. My hair is brown. I just dyed it red. It appears red. It looks red, but it's really still brown hair that's just been colored red. Institution is an artificial term that the government uses to define who the church is. It's a question of identity. And I just don't think the church should cede ground on that when it has these debates about the practical consequences of being an institution.
Okay, so what's your larger point? I mean, fine. I don't want to give up the ideals of the invisible church either. I mean, that's part of what drives me crazy about the church getting so political, because it has to be an institution to then get political. It has to hire a lobbying organization or make one, which doubles down on its institutionality. This is sort of what drives me crazy about these discussions. Anytime the church tries to get involved in these political movements, their automatic answer is to double down on being an institution and not a church.
Right, and that's what I share. That's what I'm nervous about. That's what I don't like. That's what
I don't like it either. I'm just describing it as what happens.
Yeah. So and this is why I brought up one that I thought was easier or more vanilla, like tax exemption status, because you could, I'd begin to then ask, okay, so if then tax exemption status gets wrapped up in having gender neutral bathrooms and for all churches in the U.S., based on the premise that you need to be accepting of trans individuals, okay, something woke, to get back to the subject.
Adam knows plenty well. This is one of the things that the colleges connected to institutional churches, this is what they're facing. They're going to be facing.
And so, I'm sensing from you and Bruce that the answer would be no, that church shouldn't fight to keep its institutional status. If it came to something that the church wants to take a real stand on, then you say, okay, we're not a tax-exempt institution anymore.
I'm just trying to illustrate that this is why this discussion isn't as cut and dry as if you really want to take a stand on, you want the church to take a stand on this stuff, you're going to have to double down on getting rid of your ideal of the church being as visible and invisible, made up of individual believers, not only now, but who have believed and trusted in their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in all time, everywhere. And you have to double down on it being an institution that is recognized by the government, because what you then have to do is start contracting with other institutions that are also recognized by the government, have licenses to lobby and all this other stuff, and then you have to then get involved in more and more in the institution that is the government to try to affect this change.
Yep.
Right?
Let me ask a clarifying question though. Then, do you think that parachurch organizations, I can't name one, so I'll make up one because I can't think of one right now, like the Christian Legal Fund that goes to, I don't know, the Supreme Court and hires lawyers to fight for causes that affect churches. Would you consider that part of the church?
Nope. Nope. And let me make a huge distinction. Nope, I would not. Okay.
Okay, because I don't either.
Because that is a group of individual Christians who have decided that they're concerned about certain issues and form another organization that is not a church, in order to rally other individual Christians to combine their might to have influence on an issue, not as part of the church, visible, right?
Completely agree. So then here's my
But my bigger problem is that what people are advocating for is that the church, right? The church, however you
mean like the congregations where people go gather their synods and their denomination. Like, what do you mean by that?
I'll be real specific. I talk about the LCMS. Some years ago, decided as a part of its institutionalists to put together a officially backed by the LCMS lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. to lobby representatives for issues that the institutional church was concerned about. Okay?
But you don't see that. So it just I'm clarifying. So the lobbying institution, though, it was like funded completely from the LCMS.
Yes.
I don't know.
Lutheran Church, Lutheran Center for Religious
It wasn't
Liberty.
a separate organization like I had just mentioned.
No.
That was commissioned by the LCMS. It was
I don't
supported...
even want it commissioned by the LCMS. I want it commissioned by individual people, okay,
Right.
that
So
are
I'm much more
exercising
comfortable
their
with- I'm in
Christian
agreement with you.
liberty about the things for which they are concerned, which I think is, in my opinion, pretty much a very Lutheran approach to this thing.
I completely agree.
I understand when other bodies see this differently, other bodies that are sort of looking for more of a theocratic answer to this, or other bodies that believe that the church and the state should be more wrapped up than we typically do within Lutheranism. But as far as our approach to this, individual believers who care about something that is going on in this world and think that it has a...
And our citizens have a right.
They're citizens, they have a right. They can put together organizations where they come together in more mass force to try to have a bigger voice with elected representatives than you would as an individual, but not as the church. As a group of Christians, sure, but not as a group of Christians as a church, because the church is a group of Christians specifically gathered around the preaching of Christ's gospel and the administration of his gifts and the sacraments.
Yeah, and I would say,
What do you think
I know
about that, Adam?
Yeah, or we can let Adam go.
I'd be like, that was a mic drop, Scott. Boom.
Yes.
Hit it, Adam.
Yes. I just wanted to talk about woke stuff. I agree. I'll just say that with Scott, that in principle is what I would say, but I couldn't say it as well as he does. And it always amazes me that not only is he like a quasi expert, not a qua, but a quasi expert.
That's a good description of me.
Of
That's a really good
20th century
description of so
American
many
historian,
counts.
but
Yeah.
also, I mean, when you pull this stuff out of your pocket, I'm like, holy, how does he know all this stuff? And I know it's from experience, but anyway.
Yeah, it's just a lot of sleepless nights.
But-
Insomnia do that to you, huh?
I think, but at the same time, so if I had to offer, was forced to offer some sort of new thing here, in principle, I think this is, you're right on, you hit the nail right on the head. But I think in reality, man,
I agree.
you know, that's
Why I said
and I think
this
that's
is a practical discussion,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you if you're too theoretical on this, it starts hurting people because they're thinking practically, and you sound like some pointy-headed academic in the corner debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah.
You know, and you have to be careful about how this is approached. And it's very difficult to teach people, because the people that we're talking about who have these concerns, where they come together, you know, as a group, is in this place that's called a church.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you start having a discussion with them where you say, wow, this isn't really the place to deal with that. And they're like, well, this is the place where we're together. And it gets to be confusing. And I'm cognizant of that. But this shouldn't be confusing by the supposed sort of experts, i.e. pastors and theologians, who then argue that this conversation should happen as a part of the church.
Yeah.
They aren't the ones, I have no sympathy for their confusion.
And by saying that, you're not saying not preaching the law against particular sin. I want people to be clear on that. We're not saying you shouldn't preach about issues of human sexuality, for instance. You know,
I would say be aware of how you're doing that, and be sure that the gospel has a voice in that sermon too. But no, I'm not saying that. You know, I'm not a big Bonhoeffer fan in general. But one of my favorite things I've ever read about is in his Ethics, where he preaches the 10 Commandments against the church of his time. And I think it's pretty great. And it has to do with all of the sort of social issues that were going on in Germany in his time, and in the German state church at his time. And it's pretty wonderful. But I have sympathy for the people, the people in the congregation who are confused on this and really think the church should do something. I have less sympathy as you go up that chain to the pastors and theologians who then sort of, just because they're scared to give into this and don't want to take the harder road, which is to keep the church doing what the church is called to do, preaching the gospel and administering the sacrament, and then to teach the people to act as citizens in this country where we have so much freedom to do that in the way that they are allowed to act as citizens outside of the role of the church proper.
Boom. Mic drop.
Thank you, sir.
That's outstanding. I think that's a great place to stop, too.
Okay.
I mean, it has. I mean, I know we got a time limit.
Yeah.
So, and I mean,
No,
that's
it is
nice
it
bunny
is a good
ears.
place to stop on a difficult topic, and I think we went on a lot of different directions. But if I summed up the consistency of it, it was it would be topics that you could go back to other episodes of Thinking Fellows and find more discussion on in the different contexts, which is the distinction between the proper work of the church and Christian vocations, of which we've done many of episodes in
But
the
it seems
past.
like we still need to do more.
Well, and I think it shows, Caleb, that this conversation on answering a very practical question like how to respond to woke is actually entangled with presuppositions about all sorts of things.
Yes.
So even though it's a practical answer, it can't be answered without understanding your presuppositions.
What's funny to me is that the theme of this show has been for me that any debate should begin with defining your terms. I mean, honestly, that's.
What do you mean by that? I'm just kidding.
Oh my God! All right, welcome to. Thank you for listening to Think of Fellows podcast.
This is the last time you'll hear Brit. No.
I'm fired.
Just kidding. Well, thank you for listening to the Thinking Fellows podcast. Again, we are part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcast to see everything we do. 1517 also has a growing YouTube channel where we put conference video, where we put book trailers. Currently, we have some non-branded video there too as well, and we are currently in the process of branching off with other contributors at 1517 to have associated channels with us. So things like Devotions from Chad Bird, or we have an interview podcast with Kelsey Clembera called Outside of Ourselves. We have a show called Talks with Dad Rod, which is Rod Rosenblatt and his son Ted answering quick theological questions in about 10 minutes. So you can go check all of those out. Like I said, we have some individually branded channels, and we have the 1517 channel. And if you enjoy what we do with the podcast network, you're probably going to want to go subscribe to those over there. We will catch you next time.
Bye.